So Peter, how would you describe science as it's kind of done in the West, so as to speak?
Sure. Well, I guess we understand science to be the systematic exploration of the natural world. And that in the West is done in a variety of different ways. And in fact, if you look at the buildings around this great court that we're walking here, we've just come out of a building called the Geology Building. There's a physics building coming up, then biology and chemistry back there. So the sciences are actually divided into different domains. And one of the important things, I think, to remember about the sciences is that they have quite different methods. So the idea that there's a unified scientific method is a bit of a myth, really.
Okay.
For example, in biology, evolutionary biology looks at the past, so it tends to be historical. Physics, which we're just coming up to, tends to be more mathematical and experimental. So we have a family of activities that study the natural world, but they do it in a variety of different ways. But one of the distinctive things about modern science, I think, and again, it's exemplified in the fact that we're walking around this beautiful university campus, is that it's big business. It's a major activity that's conducted at universities with many thousands of people involved at this university and other places around the world. So it's become a central part of Western society and civilization.
Where did it rise? Where did science, kind of as we know it, in that complexity you've just talked about, where did it kind of have its genesis?
Well, that's a good question, and historians have a number of answers to it. And there are three phases I think we can speak about that are important. We can go back to ancient Greece, and the ancient Greeks started to ask systematic questions about, you know, how does the world come to be the way it is? What are the basic fundamental principles that underlie the appearances that we see? And that was a really key thing. And that version of Greek science went on for 1,000, 2,000 years. And then in the 17th century, we have what's called the scientific revolution. And that really was a reaction against Greek science and a move to an experimental approach to science. That was a key distinctive thing. But it's at that stage also where we have arguments that science needs to be a corporate activity rather than an individual one. We need to have lots of people involved. It needs to be long-term and cumulative, so we accumulate knowledge and theories over a long period of time, and it needs to be something that has institutional support. Right. So at the time that could be noblemen or the king supporting scientific activity, and clearly in our own time it's the government that supports the bulk of the scientific activity.
And what was the third?
Oh, now the third one is the 19th century, and it's the 19th century when science moves into the universities in a major way. And interestingly, the 19th century is the period where we get the term scientist invented for the first time, and also it's at that time when the disciplines, as I said, chemistry, biology, physics, geology, come to be grouped together as discrete and distinct from what we would now call the humanities.
Okay.
And up until that period, the humanities was the main game in town in the universities, and the sciences were the poorer relations, but there were much stronger connections between the sciences and the humanities until the 19th century, where we get an increasing specialisation.
So if we're going back to the 17th century and that rise of science, kind of as we know it, what were the people who first started like?
Well, the people who first started the science were regarded as philosophers at the time. They were called natural philosophers who studied the philosophy of nature. And that goes back to the issue that I was talking about how the humanities and the sciences were much more closely connected. But the question we have to ask, I think, about the 17th century is what was distinctive about that period that gave rise to science in a way that really happened nowhere else, in no other culture and at no other time. And my argument would be that there are specific elements to do with the Christian tradition that are important in precipitating the emergence of modern science as we know it. And so, of course, it's, in a sense, it's an obvious point to make, but the vast bulk of people involved in the emergence of early modern science, or modern science in the 17th century, were Christian believers, and for a number of them, Christian theological principles were important to the underpinning and the motivation of their scientific
Now,
activities.
a lot of people would be really surprised to hear that, because right now, which is what we're going to explore, that there's a big divide, it seems, between those with religious belief and those who are kind of scientists. Almost like you can't be the same, but it's intriguing that basically the roots of science in the 17th century was actually out of people of faith.
That's right. And so it's not merely the case that these were people of faith, but that their faith actually informed the way they pursued science and the sorts of assumptions they thought that were necessary to doing good science. And many of them were engaged not merely in scientific activities, but also in what we call theological speculation. So Isaac Newton, who's perhaps the most famous scientist ever, wrote much more on theological topics than he did on scientific topics. And one historian has remarked that Newton was a 17th century theologian who wrote a few small works on science.
Yeah.
But you get the idea that there was at the time no conception of a conflict between fundamental religious beliefs and scientific beliefs. On the contrary, they were regarded as mutually supportive.
Why do you think, therefore, that it started kind of in the Christian European West in a way that it didn't in China? Because the Chinese developed brilliant concepts and ideas, didn't they?
Yes. And this is a famous question in the history of science. It's called the Needham question. Why science in the West and not anywhere else? And I think there are two schools of thought on this, and let me give you the one I think is right. No, I'll tell you them both. The two schools of thought, there was something missing in other cultures that meant that science wouldn't emerge. And the assumption behind that is that science is a kind of obvious thing that every culture will come to eventually if it's left to evolve properly. But the other way of thinking about it is to say, no, science is really something quite special, and it requires a particular combination of cultural ingredients to make science come about. And the West just happened to have that particular set of ingredients that together made modern science possible. And one, again, as I've argued already, one key element of that, one distinctive thing about the West is this long Judeo-Christian tradition about beliefs in the uniformity of nature, but in the 17th century also beliefs about why an experimental approach to the natural world was necessary.
So it's almost like, rather than faith getting in the road of science, there was a sense of Christian faith and belief was a foundation on which it was built.
That's right. So that we do tend today often to assume that science and religion are in conflict, and therefore that historically religious faith would have been an impediment to science, and there are specific historical instances that seem to suggest that. But in fact, if we look very carefully, what we find is that for the bulk of 17th century scientists who were the key pioneers in an emerging modern science, not merely was there no conflict, but in fact that Christian assumptions and motivations were an integral part of the scientific enterprise.
One of the narratives that's often talked about that period is actually the case of Galileo.
Yeah.
Like the idea that he was the scientist, saw the change with the Earth revolving around the sun, and it was the church, because they believed in the Bible, that said that's not true. How do you see that?
Yeah. Well, the Galileo story is one of the classic exemplary historical instances of science-religion conflict. It's one of the best known, most worked over historical episodes by historians of science. They know it really well, and they know that that story is completely wrong.
Oh, really?
And it's completely wrong for a number of reasons. But look, the bottom line, I think, is this a science and religion conflict, one? And two, is it typical of the way the Catholic Church dealt with science at the time? So to take the second question first, the Catholic Church was the most significant sponsor of astronomical research for something like 400 or 500 years, in the middle of which the Galileo affair takes place. Yes. So the idea that the Catholic Church is somehow opposed to science is deeply mistaken. Was it a science and religion conflict? No, essentially it was a conflict between two competing scientific theories. Copernicus had proposed an a sun-centred system some 50 or 60 years before Galileo came on the scene. It didn't generate particularly much controversy. Galileo had telescopic evidence that he thought supported the view, and indeed it did to some extent, but there was a strong body of scientific evidence also against the idea that the Earth was in motion around the sun. And I won't go into details, but stellar parallax, for example, was one piece of scientific evidence. And there was other evidence from physics, for example. We don't seem to be hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour. And the physics at the time couldn't explain how the Earth could possibly be in motion. But the bottom line is the Galileo affair is a very complex and complicated one, but it wasn't a clear-cut case of conflict between science and religion, and it certainly wasn't typical of Catholicism that they would be opposed to science.
So where did that divide start? Where did the divide start where it was kind of religion over here and science diametrically opposed to it?
Well, I think the 19th century is a key period for this, and there are two key works produced that talk about a history of conflict between science and religion. And these two books, respectively by a guy called John Draper and Andrew Dixon White, talk about science and religion conflict, were key texts in informing this view about science and religion conflict. But I think the other thing that we can say happening in the background, we've got evolutionary theory, which has religious implications, that some of which are not entirely welcome. So evolutionary theory, although it had Christian supporters and scientific opponents, it also had a significant reaction from the Christian community. Now, that scientific episode, the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in the early 20th century in America, developed considerable opposition. And so, at the time of its publication, controversial, yes, but the real conflict arose for the first time in the 20th century with the emergence of creationism, or scientific creationism and flood geology. And so there's a very interesting story about how evolution came to take over or to join Galileo as part of this story about a perennial and inevitable conflict between science and religion.
So Peter, in this conflict between science and religion, and being a person of faith yourself, how do you deal with that conflict?
Look, to me, fundamentally, there is no genuine conflict. I think, science tells us stories about how the world is. Science is actually a moving target. It's constantly changing. But faith is more about values, the purpose of our existence, why we're here. And those are fundamental questions that you can't have changing constantly as different things are discovered. So they're really two quite distinct realms for me. One is about the world, and what science provides us with is fantastic information and great technology, and that's a really good thing. It does many good things, but science doesn't answer the fundamental questions that, in my way of thinking, are the most important questions.
So then how do you read the Bible?
Okay, in a sense I read the Bible much as it's been read throughout the tradition of the Christian Church, which is to say that the Bible is a guide to precisely the kinds of questions that I've said are important. Why are we here? What's the purpose of our existence? What hope do we have for the future? Where do our values come from? The kinds of questions that science doesn't answer. And indeed, it's important also to understand that the Bible is not primarily intended to answer the questions that science does in fact answer. The Bible is not a scientific textbook. It's not there to tell us about particular theories about the world, although I think some of those are implicit in the biblical narratives. But it's important not to confuse the worldviews that we find contained in some of the biblical stories, to confuse that with the central message, which is about purpose, meaning and value.
So how then would you answer somebody who said, well, I believe in evolution and so therefore I can't believe the Bible?
Well, I think ever since Darwin published his theory of evolution, there have been Christians who've had no problem with evolutionary theory, and in essence I'm one of them. I don't think that evolutionary theory does make us ask serious questions, because there are questions about meaning and purpose that evolution does actually seem to have some implications for. And amongst the sciences, I think it's quite special and unique in that respect. But ultimately, I don't think that there's anything in evolutionary theory that's a challenge to the fundamental beliefs of Christianity.
So Peter, this series is called Jesus the Game Changer. So for you personally, how has Jesus been the game changer?
Well, Karl, I think when Jesus appears on the scene in the first century, he has a radical new message. He preaches a set of values and a view about the meaning of life and the end times that it's quite unique. And that gives rise to a whole series of institutions that really are fundamental to where the world is today. One of them is this university that we're looking at. Universities are founded by the Christian Church. There are values and legal systems and whole sets of assumptions really that arise from those events and that historical person who appeared on the scene in the very first century. So really Jesus is crucial to the kind of world we live in with in the West here, with the values and institutions that it has.